Hello and welcome to today's economics podcast for Pigott School sixth form students. Today I'm going to talk through and recap on one of the things you would have first learnt last year and the basic fundamental of economics, demand and supply curves, and a bit of elasticity. So first of all, if we go through the definitions, which we need to be precise on. So the definition of demand is the amount consumers are willing and able to buy at a given price. So the willing and able is very important. You're not a real customer if you want to buy a Ferrari but aren't able to. And you're not a real customer, so some people talk about products that they're not interested in. Well, they're not customers. That is not effective demand. So demand, you've got to be willing and able, and it's at that given price level. And then with supply, very similar. That supply is the amount producers are willing and able to supply at a given price level. So how much are producers, how inclined they are to bring something to the market at its going price. Very basically, if you think of your curves, you've got your demand curve that slopes downwards, which should make sense. At very high prices, only a few people are going to be willing or able to buy something. And then as the price goes down, more people are going to be willing and or able to buy it. So that's why demand slopes downwards. And supply will slope upwards from left to right, basically because of the profit motive. So when the price goes up, producers will think there's more money into that market, so more people will come into it. So remember, your demand and supply provides us with signalling and rationing functions. So signal to producers to come into the market if the price is high, and on our demand side, it's going to ration consumers out if the price is too high. So they are some of the features of demand and supply. They will provide signalling and rationing functions to the market. Your determinants of demand, things that are going to shift demand left or right. Remember, if there is a change in price, it would be a movement up or down the curve. So if the price goes down, there'll be a movement down the curve. If the price goes up, there'll be a movement up the curve. So a price change would not shift the curve. But the things that are going to shift the curve, left or right, I'll go through in just a sec. So if the demand curve is going right, that means there is a greater demand. It means we want more of it. If the demand curve is going left, that means there is less demand, means we want less of it, and the same with supply. So your determinants of demand, you might remember from the a pint acrostic that we remembered, and they are advertising. So if Coca-Cola have an advert, all of these are ceteris paribus. So all other things being equal, if Coca-Cola advertise their product, then the demand curve will go to the right. Demand will increase. Population. So if there is a increase in population locally or nationally, more people are going to demand your particular product. The I is income. So we'll get onto this in a minute. This obviously depends if it's a normal or inferior good. But if consumers' incomes go up, then there will be a greater demand, ceteris paribus usually, for that product. The number of substitutes. So for an individual product, if it's got lots of substitutes, that's going to make the demand for that product go down. And taste and fashion. So you'll often see sort of fads, periods of time where things are in and out of fashion, the must-have, where people will want to buy and get something. In terms of supply, same with demand. If price changes, it's a movement up or down the curve in terms of the signalling, profit motive function. But things that shift supply, a bit more varied. So weather is a big one for your agricultural products. If you've got a fire on the news this morning, there's a Greek fires. If crops are destroyed, if there's a drought, that's going to mean the supply curve goes left, but you might also have bumper crops where the weather is doing well, perfect conditions, and the supply will go right. But the big things we're looking at here are basically the costs of raw materials. So if wage costs or input costs at all, raw material costs fluctuate, go up or down, that's going to be a firm's biggest input cost and decide whether they supply more or not. In terms of what the government do with supply, tax and subsidy, if the government impose a tax, then the demand supply curve is going to go to the left. How much the consumer and producer pays will depend on the elasticity of demand, and if there is a subsidy, and subsidies are usually put on merit goods, things that are good for us, or the government thinks that are good for us. If a subsidy is put on a product, then the supply is going to go to the right. It's going to be cheaper at all output levels, all prices for the producer to produce them, therefore the price is going to go down. And also things like technology and improvement in technology is going to lead to easier production, more production. Obviously put together, you should never draw a demand and supply curve diagram that doesn't have both on. You should have both your demand and supply. It should show your equilibrium level of output, obviously where demand equals supply, and it should always reflect the elasticities, which we'll look at in a minute. So when your curve is shifting, you decide which curve is shifting. So reading a multiple choice question or looking at a data response, think, is it fitting demand or supply? Is it one of the determinants of demand? Is it one of the determinants of supply? Then think, is it a good or bad thing? So is it going to improve supply? Is it going to improve demand? Is it going to make it worse? And then draw your curve which way it's shifting, left or right for good or bad, left being bad, less, right being good, more. Then draw the new curve, the new equilibrium, and show the new output levels. Absolutely vital. Remember, the diagrams are going to be the first thing an examiner sees from you, so make sure they are absolutely correct. You can also obviously show on the diagram consumer and producer surplus and what the changes is happening with things shifting. So on to elasticity of demand and supply. Remember that elasticity shows the responsiveness of demand to a change in a variable. So there are various elasticities of demand. You've got price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, income elasticity of demand, or cross elasticity of demand. So the first one is price elasticity of demand, which might be put down as PED in shorthand. So this shows the responsiveness of demand to a change in price. So your formula will be percentage change in quantity demanded at the top, divided by percentage change in price at the bottom. So you're looking at how demand changes to a change in price. Price elasticity of supply, it's always going to be the similar formula, percentage change in quantity supplied at the top, divided by percentage change in price at the bottom. So that's showing you if price changes, how quickly, how easily can suppliers react to lower or increase supply. Then we've got income elasticity of demand, or YED, percentage change in income at the top, percentage change in quantity demand at the top, divided by percentage change in income at the bottom. So this shows us when income changes, how responsive our demand will change. And then cross elasticity of demand, percentage change in quantity demanded of good A at the top, divided by percentage change in price of good B at the bottom. So that's showing you if the price of one good or service changes, how that affects something else. So it's looking at the complements and substitute relationship. Remember that in terms of the numbers, if the number comes out between 0 and 1, it is inelastic. So that means that if price changes, demand doesn't change by as much. So to give you an example, if in price elasticity of demand, if price rises by 10%, demand might only fall by 5%. Okay, so that will come out as a number of 0.5, and that's obviously between 0 and 1, and that would show it's inelastic, that the good is not very responsive to price changes. We're going to buy it anyway. If it is above 1, so if the number is above 1, that means that the price might have changed, but the demand might have changed by more. So it might be that price has gone down by 5%, but that has led to an increase in demand of 10%. And if it comes out as 1, that means it is unitary. So the change in demand and price is the same. So price might fall by 5%, leading to an increase in demand by 5%, so that would come out as 1 or unitary. In terms of the things that make something inelastic in demand, so if you think of the things that are inelastic in demand and the reasons, I'll give you some examples. We've got toothpicks, for a reason we'll go to in a minute, oil, And the reason being, it will either be it's a necessity, so oil is a necessity, we have to have it. It might not have any substitutes, so like oil, we have some substitutes, but they're quite weak substitutes. So if it's a necessity, you need it. If it has no substitutes, that makes it inelastic. But also the percentage of income that you spend on something. So toothpicks are inelastic because you spend such a small proportion of your income on them. If the price doubles, like Freddo's went from 10p to 20p, it's a 100% price increase. But because it's such a small price to begin with, we don't really notice, so we buy them anyway. And the last point there is addiction. So obviously drugs, if you are addicted to a drug, then you're going to buy it no matter what the change in price. In terms of how elastic or inelastic something is in supply, it's basically, can we change the supply of it very quickly? So the most inelastic of things are sort of cinema capacity and football stadiums. And if you think why, it's basically the time. Everything becomes more elastic in time. So football stadiums, if you need to increase the capacity in the short term, you can't really do it. So the time constraints there. For other things, it might be, can we keep stocks? So if you're able to store something, which is why agricultural products are often inelastic, but if you've got a store cupboard full of something and then there's a sudden rush in demand for it, well, then you can increase the supply pretty easily. It might be spare capacity of factory. So again, if you're only using 50% of your factory, a sudden rush of orders come in, you can employ more staff, then you can easily increase the output. And linked to that, we've got raw materials. So if raw materials are very easy to get hold of, then you are able to increase capacity easily. Remember, in terms of your demand and supply diagrams, if something is inelastic, it is very steep. So if you're showing inelastic demand or supply, so for housing, they are both very steep. And if something is very elastic, so it's very easy to change demand, or it's very easy to change supply, then they are very shallow. So always remember, reflect those in your diagrams. In terms of the signs, so the signs that go in front of your elasticity, price elasticity of demand will always be negative. So price elasticity of demand, when price goes up, demand will fall, and vice versa. So PED is always negative, so the sign almost doesn't matter. With YED, with income elasticity of demand, the sign does matter. If it is a plus, it means it's a normal good. So that means the income has gone up, so that would be a plus sign, and the demand for it has gone up, so that would be another plus. So things like holidays, if your income goes up, you buy more of them. So if YED, if it's a plus, it's a normal good. If it's a minus for YED, it is an inferior good. So if your income goes up and your demand for it goes down, Tesco value beans, it is an inferior good. For price elasticity of supply, it's the opposite of PED. It is always positive. So the supply curve slopes upwards. If you think why, when price goes up, the supply goes up due to the profit motive. So PES is always positive. For XED, cross elasticity of demand, this is the one that students find trickiest. If it is a complement, it will be negative. If you think why, if the price of an Xbox goes up, so the price, that's a plus sign, your Xbox has gone up in price, that means the demand for games will go down because fewer people will buy the Xbox console because that's a plus, it's gone up in price. That has led to a minus in the buying of the games, so the two signs are different, so it will be negative. For cross-elasticity and substitutes, the sign will be positive. So if you think of a Mars bar and a Snickers, if the price of a Mars bar goes up, the demand for a Snickers will go up because they're a substitute. One is now more expensive, you replace it with the other one, so both signs will be positive. Okay, so that was our quick recap of demand, supply and elasticity.